Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to your screencast of Jacksonian democracy, politics, economics, states' rights, legacies, etc. It's going to go on just a little bit, but don't worry because you can pause me at any time. So rather than break up into three different screencasts like we did with Jefferson, we're just going to do one huge Jackson extravaganza coming to you from our wood panel Jacksonian office. And if you have any questions or criticism of this screencast, I don't want to hear it because I am impervious to criticism and I am the voice of whatever is right, to paraphrase Andrew Jackson. So let's jump in, shall we? Here we go. It's a new era of democracy. There is a new effort among politicians to appeal to the masses and not just the Virginia elite or the New England merchant federalists. New democracy is based on this idea of universal manhood suffrage rather than property qualifications. And yes, you heard manhood suffrage right. That means it's much more easy for the common man to be influential when it comes to votes. We can remove property qualifications, then so many more new people can vote. And remember, at this time, 1812 to 1821, there are 6 new Western states granted. They have universal manhood suffrage. And between 1810 and 1820, 4 Eastern states also significantly reduced voting requirements. There's also an effort caused by the Panic of 1819 that will influence politics dramatically. Western farmers were very resentful of Eastern bankers. There was a land speculation. The bubble burst on Western land. Eastern banks called in their debts. The Bank of the United States made banks call in their debts. And so the Western farmers who lost all their land felt they had been sold a bag of goods. They had been told to buy land that would be valuable and then were foreclosed on. Shades of Shays Rebellion and the housing bubble of 2008. And there's a push to get more people involved in politics to affect change. Let's find out what happens. So, don't forget, in 1820, the Missouri Compromise sets the compromise balance of states at 11 to 11, and the boundary of where slavery can exist at the southern end of the Missouri border, even though Missouri will be a slave state. To which Thomas Jefferson said, "That is like a fire bell in the night. Ding, 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 ding. Can you hear it? It's going to cause problems in 30 years." But we have the Missouri Compromise having recently solved a potentially powder keg problem around the expansion of slavery. At this point, in the collection of 1824, we have 4 candidates: Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, William Crawford, and Henry Clay. Jackson is the most popular vote winner, but it is no majority in the Electoral College. He needs 131 to win. 270 to win. Pick your map now. What's it going to be? Oh, it looks like that. The House of Reps get to decide. They pick from the top 3, so Clay's out, but he's still Speaker of the House. So he has a lot of influence. Clay throws his weight behind Adams, and Adams becomes president, and Clay becomes Secretary of State. What? Because at that point, anybody who was Secretary of State was sort of like next in line to be president. Vice president mattered not at all. So everyone said, well, Andrew Jackson in particular said, "I was the winner. I won the most popular votes. I won the most electoral votes. And there was a corrupt bargain to steal this election from me, where the cronies in Washington got behind each other, and John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay worked out a corrupt bargain to steal the election from me." I'll just pause for you to make connections. Wait, you can pause yourself. Let's keep going. Meanwhile, in 1828, the biggest issue of the Adams presidency came over the Tariff of Abominations. 1828, you know a tariff is bad when it's called Tariff of Abominations. And you can see in the picture this very specific regional support for the tariff. The southern states not behind it. Mid-Atlantic states particularly in favor of it. So here's the issue. Congress increases their tariff on goods. Remember, tariff is a tax on imported goods from 23% to 37%. Jackson, who is from Tennessee, thought it would be okay. He supported the tariff. He thought it would not pass, and it would give Adams a political black eye. But actually, it backfired because it did pass, and he inherited it as president when Andrew Jackson wins the election in 1828. Webster supported it, which was a reverse from the 1816 tariff, in which northern New England were against the tariff because they would protect northern manufacturers. But the South hated it a lot, as they imported and exported a lot. And if you think about it, the South is exporting cotton, then they have to pay more to export their cotton, and they're buying clothes from Great Britain, and now they have to pay a lot more for the clothes they're buying from Great Britain. John C. Calhoun, famous vice president later, anonymously wrote the South Carolina Exposition, where he denounced the tariff as unjust and unconstitutional, and said states should reimagine those Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. Remember those? Oh, you should nullify the tariff of abominations. No states joined South Carolina in this particular process right now. It did teach John C. Calhoun that the next time he wanted to nullify anything, he was going to make sure he needed to get more southern states on board before going out on his own, because that's going to cause a problem. Meanwhile, the election of 1828. Remember, there is no two political parties. They're all Democratic Republicans. But that being said, there are sort of nationalist Republicans who support John Quincy Adams and the Hamiltonian vision of America, and there's Democratic Republicans who support Jackson. Jackson styles himself as being the legacy of the Jeffersonian era type of democracy. So, Andrew Jackson makes history. He's the first president from the West, Tennessee. He's seen as a great common man. What example of what a common man could achieve. Although he owned 142 slaves, he was a Revolutionary War veteran. He got wounded by a British saber when he was 13 years old. He went back to Tennessee, kind of took over his father's very Scottish layered role and responsibility for people in the hills of Tennessee, became a lawyer, and then did quite well for himself, accidentally invading Florida and hanging people in Pensacola, destroying the Creek Indians in the Creek Indian War in Georgia and Alabama, and generally causing a ruckus until becoming a national political figure. No sitting president had been voted out since John Adams in 1800. It's like it was the first time it happened in 28 years. Let's make connections yourself. There was an increased voter turnout. People were super excited about Andrew Jackson. It definitely showed the balance of power was shifting from east to west. America heretofore, which is a great word, had been ruled by educated, wealthy elites in one form or another, whether they were from Virginia or from Boston. At the inauguration, there was a huge, rowdy crowd in the White House. People getting their muddy boots on the carpet, standing on chairs, and everyone says, "See, I told you this is exactly what happens when you elect someone from Tennessee." Old Hickory, because he was intransigent. Hickory is one of the hardest woods, and you never use it to make something you want to be soft and flexible. Uh, he was often sickly and violent-tempered. Some people said from the bullets that were still leaching blood into his system from a number of war wounds and duels. But he personified the New West. He saw the federal government as a haven for the wealthy, and very detached from the common folk experience. He wanted to drain the swamp. And of course, Washington, D.C. was built on a swamp, so it was still literally kind of swampy. He was both a nationalist and a unionist, though. He did believe in the idea of the nation, and was trying to do things that would keep the nation and the union together. He said he should reward loyal supporters with government jobs. It was called the spoils system. He says every man is as good as his neighbor, and many corrupt civil servants, he said, should be eliminated. Although in many ways he didn't get rid of too many civil servants. He managed to keep a lot of people who actually knew what they were doing in office. But he did say, to the victors go the spoils, and if you were supporting me, I'm going to give you government jobs. So again, this idea that many intellectuals were also very much behind the concept of the Jacksonian democracy. There was this increase in suffrage. It was the end of the caucus system and the beginnings of nominating conventions. It's a little too much detail to worry about, but it became a more democratic process of picking candidates for elections. And of course, we have the spoils system, where we reward political supporters with public office. And you think of the idea that government servants should rotate in office. They shouldn't have 30 or 40-year careers. Brief aside, never mind, move on. Kitchen cabinet. Remember, the cabinet doesn't really exist. Washington created the idea of the cabinet, and Jackson expanded that to a group of 13 advisors. They were unofficial. They were branded the kitchen cabinet by critics, angry that they were not answerable to Congress. People declared they were unconstitutional. So if someone was really going to be a strict constructionist like Jefferson was, then Jackson was acting in opposition to that ideal. And it leads in some ways to, again, the show off and tension between northern New England merchants and Federalists, the Nationalist Republicans, and the southern states, western states' rights folks, the Jacksonian Democrats. Daniel Webster introduced a bill to curb the sale of Western lands. The West was obviously against it. The South sided with the West. The debate lasted in the Senate for 9 days. This is back when still people debated about things. Each side thought they had won. Senator Robert Hayne of South Carolina accused New England of disloyalty during the War of 1812. He blasted Northern tariffs as being good for manufacturers only, and he championed Calhoun's doctrine of nullification, whereas Senator Daniel Webster of Massachusetts insisted that people, not states, had framed the Constitution. It says we the people. He said the doctrine of nullification is unconstitutional. It's not states, it's people. And he says liberty and union, one and inseparable, now and forever. People were good orators back then. That's inspiring. Meanwhile, the Peggy Eaton affair, because it all comes down to scandals. The wife of Secretary of War Eaton being snubbed by other cabinet members' wives, especially Mrs. Calhoun, because she was the daughter of a tavern keeper, a famous tavern keeper in Washington, D.C., who married the Secretary of War, and the other privileged elite politicians' wives were quite socially snubbing of her. Real Housewives, Washington, D.C. version. But Jackson, meanwhile, remembered the trauma that inflicted on his late wife, Rachel, who was basically harassed to death during the campaign because Jackson had married her even though he hadn't officially become unmarried from his first wife. So there were charges of bigamy. She took those charges to heart. She died during the campaign, and Jackson was a little bitter, understandably. He demanded that cabinet members make their wives include her. He began purging Calhoun allies in the Senate in 1831, and Martin Van Buren gained attention to Jackson by being very nice to Mrs. Eaton. Martin Van Buren was a bachelor, so he was like, aha, I'm going to be nice to Peggy Eaton. That's going to get me in good with Andrew Jackson, become vice president. And there'll be a split between the Jacksons and the Calhoun factions of the Republican Party / Democratic Party. Stay tuned. Meanwhile, the nullification crisis of 1832. Remember the Tariff of Abominations of 1828? Well, they tried again with the Tariff of 1832. We're going to lower the tariff, but we're going to still be very high in some categories. It's still protective in nature. South didn't like that. South Carolina passed a declaration of nullification in 1832 and threatened to secede if Jackson didn't remove the tariff. And you know what happens when you threaten Jackson. Violently angry in private, he threatened to hang nullifiers, including Calhoun, dispatched a modest army and naval force to South Carolina. Meanwhile, cooler heads prevail. Henry Clay says, wait, guys, can we compromise? I'm from Kentucky. Tariff would be reduced by 10% over 8 years. The rates are going to fall. Can we get along with this? It just barely squeaks through Congress to avoid tension. But meanwhile, Congress also passes the force bill, which Jackson wanted to. So I can force states to follow the law. And in many ways, it's like the same thing with the Stamp Act and the Declaratory Act, right? We're going to take the Stamp Act back, but we can pass anything we want to. And everyone was just like, hey, they caved on the Stamp Act. Very similar. We dealt with the compromise and the tariff. We are going to ignore the force bill. But people are starting to think Andrew Jackson is acting a little imperial. He says, well, I am the representative of the people. The president is the embodiment of the people's will, not Congress. And anything I do is in the name of the people. And people thought that was very imperial. And every time a president tries to expand executive power, they are open to those kinds of complaints. The election of 1832, very quickly, Jackson wins. They sees it as a validation of his policies, as a validation of his anti-monopolistic attack the rich, attack the elites, and it gives more power to the states to promote equal opportunity. What's with this bank? Let's leave it alone. But suffice it to say, the bank represented huge business interests, and Henry Clay tried to ram the bank recharter before election to tie up Jackson. What is Jackson going to do? He's going to sign it, or if he signs it, he'll alienate Western support. If he vetoes it, he'll alienate the wealthy and influential in the East. Jackson, the bank is trying to kill me, but would I kill it? One thing we know about Andrew Jackson, he kills whatever's in his way. He vetoes the bus recharter in 1832. And then he takes all the bank's money. And there's some other stuff in there about McCulloch v. Maryland. We have questions, but don't worry, we'll talk about it later. He takes all the state's money and puts it in his own favorite state banks, his wildcat or pet banks instead. He hopes to cause an economic crisis to show everyone how badly managed the Bank of the United States is and how it's tied into political and established Eastern elites. There's a huge financial crisis. Jackson makes the bank look bad, but also creates to an economic recession. Some benefits of the Bank of the United States was that it did provide some stability around these wildcat crazy banks, because people had just were passing paper notes around. Paper money belonged to banks, belonged to states. There's inflation. That's just a bad thing, right? Although it does spur economic expansion by making credit and currency available. And there's a safe place to put federal government funds. But with Jackson, he instituted what's called the Specie Circular, because Jackson had been ruined in the Panic of 1819 when he had gone into debt and credit to buy Western lands. And he says, you know what? That's irresponsible. We need to require that all Western land sales be paid for with hard money, gold and silver, and it's going to really mess with the Western farmers and Southern farmers that are the backbone of Jackson's support. Brings hard times to those Westerners who already are living in hard times because they're Western farmers. Meanwhile, there is some general economic expansion. Incorporation laws make it easier for corporations and charters to create businesses. States make it easier to create businesses. There's this idea of limited liability. So if my business messes up or goes bankrupt, I'm not on the hook for it by myself. I'm only limitedly on the hook for it, along with my other partners. And it increases along with this idea of sort of the democracy of economic opportunity. Very quickly, there's some Supreme Court issues in terms of national versus states' rights. The Charles River Bridge case is only significant in the sense that it increases power to the federal government, essentially, to create a contract for interstate commerce. It encourages development and transportation via competition, and it's another step towards democracy under Jackson. Let's talk about Jackson and the states' rights. Even though Jackson believed in the idea of states' rights, he also believed in the supremacy of national laws. So there's a conflict there. And you see on the left the picture of Jacksonian King Andrew I, as his critics called him. He refused to spend federal money for intrastate improvements. For example, the Maysville Road would really fix the road in Kentucky. Remember Henry Clay? Pork legislation. And it would be a good thing for commerce. But because it was only within the boundaries of Kentucky, Jackson vetoed that particular bill. In fact, Jackson used the veto 6 times, which was twice as many times as his previous predecessors put together. You read in your book, you also read about the removal of Native Americans. This goes back in some ways both to states' rights and to a national union. Jackson believed that finding land was essential to preserving the Union. And one thing we needed to do then was to remove Native Americans, who were ultimately doomed to not be successful in land where whites already were. And he thought it was just a matter of time before people would need to be relocated somewhere else. This goes into a whole lot of problems. The 5 civilized tribes, the 5 civilized nations who had treaties, who were independent nations, all objected to this forcefully. The issue, of course, and we'll get into Cherokee in particular, but the issue, of course, comes down to whether Georgia, in particular, can force people off territory in Georgia. And it's going to lead to a couple of Supreme Court cases. Essentially, John Marshall, Supreme Court Justice, ruled that Georgia's laws had no jurisdiction within Cherokee Nation boundaries, bullet point number 2 there, because Indian nations are subdependent foreign nations. He said the only entity that can deal with Indian nations is the federal government. Jackson says, hey, I don't care what you say. John Marshall has made his decision, let him enforce it. Andrew Jackson basically says, John Marshall has no army. I'm the one with the army. If Georgia wants to do this, then Georgia can do this. And in fact, I've got Congress to pass the Indian Removal Act, which gives me legal federal authority to assist Georgia in this process. And then you can see some of the specifics of, particularly in the Cherokees case, the Trail of Tears, where 4,000 die en route, 25% of the Choctaw die on the passage to the Oklahoma Territory. So what's Jackson's legacy? Um, some positive contributions, perhaps, demonstrated the value of the strong executive. He became the champion of the common people, and he established the Democratic Party that we have today, and really sparked a two-party system. Some liabilities, perhaps. Spoil system of rewarding government jobs to people who were political supporters. Killing the Bank of the United States led to bank failures and economic crisis for the next 70 years. He snubbed the authority of the Supreme Court, the judicial branch. The Trail of Tears is really kind of an unqualified disaster in many ways. And his break with Calhoun did lead to deeper sectionalism, ironically, given that Jackson was really interested in keeping the Union together. So, very quickly, addendum. The election of 1836. Andrew Jackson's vice president, Martin Van Buren, and we have the emergence of the Whig Party. The Whig Party came in opposition to the imperial powers of George III in Parliament, and so the Whig Party was formed in opposition to the imperial powers of Andrew Jackson. They were kind of the extension of Hamilton's Federalists, and so they are a combination of Clay and Calhoun joining forces to mutually hate Andrew I. They chose war hero William Henry Harrison, otherwise known as Tippecanoe, because remember the War of 1812, defeated Tecumseh and the Prophet at the Battle of Tippecanoe. And Martin Van Buren was Jackson's hand-picked successor. So there's the battle right in front of us. Eventually, Martin Van Buren does win, but we do have this sort of idea of who are the Whigs and who are the Democrats. The Whigs are basically Federalists with a new Whig. They were supported by northern industrialists and merchants. They supported Henry Clay's American system of focusing on manufacturing and a national system of economic improvement. They sought to reduce the spoils system. They have a Southern states' rights advocates were angry at Jackson's stand on nullification. And later on, they will support social reforms like abolition and temperance. They also sought to use the national government to solve the ills of society. So if you were going to try and make a comparison, it's a little bit of Republican, a little bit of Democrat as today. On the other hand, we have the Democrats, supported by the common people and the political machines in the East. They favored states' rights as opposed to the American system. They also favored the spoils system. They were anti-monopoly, they believed in competition, and they believed the federal government should not be involved in people's personal lives. So, again, kind of a combination of our modern-day Democrats and Republicans. Martin Van Buren, Old Kinderhook, from upstate New York, son of a tavern bar owner. He was the first president born under an American flag, not born after the American Revolution. He was a smart and deft New York politician, dubbed the Little Magician, and he further helped develop the two-party system. He did preside over the Panic of 1837 that was caused by Jackson's specie circular. He was blamed for that. But he did formalize an independent treasury system, otherwise known as those pet banks I talked about, that did help to stabilize a little bit the chaos that ensued after Jackson killed the Bank of the United States. Speaking of the Panic of 1837, over-speculation, risky loans, Jackson's hard money policy, high grain prices, two major British banks fail. It's causing a major economic recession in the United States. American banks failed, took several $1 million of government funds with it. Prices of land sales dropped, custom revenues dried up. These newly emerging factories that were becoming quite popular in the 1820s and 30s started to close and fire people, and unemployment rises dramatically. So how are we going to fix that? We need to create an independent treasury bill in 1840. We have to do something about the panic. Van Buren tried to stay true to the Jacksonian idea of separation of government from the economy. They decided to separate the government funds from private banks entirely. This would, in theory, make money safer, but not available to make loans, which is problematic. It ends up getting repealed a year later, but returns in 1846 with James K. Polk. The last thing we're going to talk about is the election of 1840, the Log Cabin Campaign. Van Ruin was renominated by Democrats. Whigs chose Harrison again, and they made John Tyler his running mate this time, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Tyler is kind of a Democrat in Whigs clothing. But they wanted him to balance the ticket so they could appeal to a larger regional voting base. The main thing we want to remember about the election of 1840 is that both sides were more interested in winning than they were about what they believed in. They would tell every group what they wanted to hear. Voters blamed Van Buren and the Democrats for the Depression. Whigs created this myth that Harrison was a poor Western farmer who grew up in a log cabin. They call it the Log Cabin Campaign and hard cider, whereas William Henry Harrison was actually a Virginia planter who grew up in a plantation and was quite well off and only later moved to Indiana. Martin Van Buren, who was styled as the one who drank champagne and the part of the political elites, grew up the son of a tavern keeper in upstate New York and actually was born in a log cabin. But let's not let facts get in the way of a good political story. It's the first mass turnout of voters, and the campaign, like we said, is more style over substance. Ladies and gentlemen, I leave you to make your own connections to our current political and economic issues. That was the Jacksonian democracy in somewhat of a nutshell. I look forward to our next time when we'll talk more about the burgeoning sectional crisis.